The Battery and the Boiler. Adventures in the Laying of Submarine Electric Cables by R. M. Ballantyne. Published in London in 1883. Chapter 1, in which the hero makes his first flash and explosion. Somewhere about the middle of this 19th century, a baby boy was born on the raging sea in the midst of a howling tempest. That boy was the hero of this tale. He was cradled in squalls and nourished in squalor, a week of dirty weather having converted the forecabin of the emigrant ship into something like a pigsty. Appreciating the situation, no doubt, the baby boy began his career with a squall that harmonized with the weather, and, as the steward remarked to the ship's cook, continued for to squall straight on end all that day and night without so much as ever taken breath. It is but right to add that the steward was prone to exaggeration. "Steward," said the ship's cook in reply, as he raised his eyes from the contemplation of his bubbling coppers, "take my word for it, that there babby what just been launched ain't a-goin' to shovel off his mortal coil, as the play-actor said, without making his mark somehow and somewheres." "What makes you think so, Johnson?" asked the steward. "What makes me think so, steward?" replied the cook, who was a huge, good-natured young man. "Well, I'll tell 'ee. I was standing close to the forehatch at the time, a-talking to Jim Bragg, and the father of the babby, poor fellow, he was standing by the foretopsail halyards holding on to a belayin' pin and looking as white as a sheet, for I got a glance at him 2 or 3 times during the flashes o' lightnin'. Well, steward, there was an lightnin' playin' around the mizzen truck, and the main truck, and the fore truck, and the end of the flyin' jim boom, and the spanker boom, and there came a flash that seemed to set afire the entire universe, and then a burst of thunder like 50 great guns gone off all at once in a hurry. At that identical moment, steward, there came up the forecabin a yell that beat— well, I can't say what it beat, but it reminded me of that unfortunate pig as got his tail jammed in the capstan off Cape Horn. The father gave a gasp. 'It's born,' says he. 'More likes it's have busted,' growled Jim Bragg. 'You're an unfeelin' monster, Bragg,' says I, 'and though you are the ship's carpenter, I will say it, you haven't got no more sympathy than the fluke of an anchor.' Hows'ever, the poor father didn't hear the remark, for he went down all below of a heap. Head, legs, and arms. Anyhow, then there came another yell, and another, and half a dozen more, which was followed by another flash of lightning, and drowned in another round roar of thunder. But the yells from below kept on, and came on strong between times, making no account whatever of the whistling wind and rattling ropes which they riz above easy. Now, steward, do you mean to tell me that all that signifies nothink? Do you suppose that babby could go through life like an ordinary babby? No, it couldn't, not even if it was to try, which it won't." Having uttered this prophecy, the cook resumed the contemplation of his bubbling coppers. "Well, I suppose you're right, John Johnson," said the steward. "Yes, I'm right, Tom Thomson," returns the cook, with the nod and air of a man who is never wrong. And the cook was right, as the reader who continues to read shall find out in the course of time. The gale in which little Robin Wright was thus launched upon the sea of time blew the sails of that emigrant ship, the Seahorse, to ribbons. It also blew the masts out of her, leaving her a helpless wreck on the breast of the palpitating sea. Then it blew a friendly sail in sight, by which passengers and crew were rescued and carried safe back to old England. There they separated, some to re-embark in other emigrant ships, some to renew the battle of life at home, thenceforward and forever after to vilify the sea in all its aspects, except when viewed at a safe distance from the solid land. Little Robin's parents were among the latter. His father, a poor gentleman, procured a situation as accountant in a mercantile house. His mother busied herself, and she was a very busy little creature, with the economics of home. She clothed Robin's body and stored his mind. Among other things, she early taught him to read from the Bible. As Robin grew, he waxed strong and bold and lively, becoming a source of much anxiety mingled with delight to his mother, and of considerable alarm mixed with admiration and surprise to his father. He possessed an inquisitive mind. He inquired into everything, including the antique barometer and the household clock, both of which were heirlooms, and were not improved by his inquiries. Strange to say, Robin's chief delight in those early days was a thunderstorm. The rolling of heaven's artillery seemed to afford inexpressible satisfaction to his little heart, but it was the lightning that affected him most. It filled him with a species of awful joy, no matter how it came, whether in the forked flashes of the storm or in the lambent gleamings of the summer sky. He would sit and gaze at it in solemn wonder. Even in his earliest years, he began to make inquiries into that remarkable and mysterious agent. "Musa," he said one day, during a thunderstorm, raising his large eyes to his mother's face with intense gravity, "Musa, what is lightnin'?" Mrs. Wright, who was a soft little unscientific lady with gorgeous eyes, sat before her son perplexed. "Well, child, really, I don't know what it is." "Don't know?" echoed Robin with surprise. "I thought you knowed everything." "No, not everything, dear," replied Mrs. Wright with a deprecatory smile. "But here comes your father, who will tell you." "Does he know everything?" asked the child. No, not exactly, but he knows many things. Oh, ever so many things," answered the cautious wife and mother. The accountant had barely crossed his humble threshold and sat down when Robin clambered on his knee and put the puzzling question. "Farsa, what is lightnin'?" "Lightning, my boy? Well, it's let me see, it's fire, of course, of some sort, that comes out of the clouds and goes slap into the earth. There, don't you see it?" Robin did see it, and was so awestruck by the crash which followed the blinding flash that he forgot at the moment to push his inquiries further, much to his father's satisfaction, who internally resolved to hunt up the Encyclopaedia Britannica that very evening, letter L, and study it. In process of time, Robin increased in size. As he expanded in body, he developed in mind and heart, for his little mother, although profoundly ignorant of electricity and its effects, was deeply learned in the scriptures. But Robin did not hunger in vain after scientific knowledge. By good fortune, he had a cousin Sam Shipton, who was 14 years older than himself, and a clerk at a neighbouring railway station, where there was a telegraphic instrument. Now, Sam, being himself possessed of strongly scientific tendencies, took a great fancy to little Robin, and sought to enlighten his young mind on many subjects where Musa's knowledge failed. Of course, he could not explain all that he himself knew about electricity. The child was too young for that. But he did what he could, and introduced him one day to the interior of the station, where he filled his youthful mind with amazement and admiration by his rapid and apparently meaningless manipulation of the telegraph instrument. Cousin Sam, however, did a good more for him than that in the course of time, but before proceeding further, we must turn aside for a few minutes to comment on that wonderful subject which is essentially connected with the development of this tale. Chapter 2 refers to a notable character. Sparks, rule, are looked upon as a race of useless and disreputable fellows. Their course is usually erratic. They fly upward, downward, forward, and backward, here, there, and everywhere. You never know when you have them, or what will be their next flight. They often create a good deal of alarm, sometimes much surprise. They seldom do any good, and frequently cause irreparable damage. Only when caught and restrained or directed do sparks become harmless and helpful. But there is one spark in this world, a grand, glowing, gushing fellow, who has not his equal anywhere. He is as old as the hills, perhaps older, and wide as the world, perchance wider. Similar to ordinary sparks in some respects, he differs from them in several important particulars. Like many, he is fast, but immeasurably faster than all other sparks put together. Unlike them, however, he submits to be led by master minds. Stronger than Hercules, he can rend the mountains. Fleeter than Mercury, he can outstrip the light. Gentler than Zephyr, he can assume the condition of a current and enter our very marrow without causing pain. His name is electricity. No one knows what he is. Some philosophers have said that he is a fluid because he flows. As well might they call him a wild horse because he bolts, or a thief because he lurks. We prefer to call him a spark, because in that form only is he visible, at least when handled by man. Talking of that, it was not until the last century that master minds found out how to catch and handle our spark. In all the previous centuries, he had been roaming gaily about the world in perfect freedom, sometimes gliding silently to and fro like an angel of light, sometimes leaping forth with frightful energy in the midst of raging tempest like a destructive demon, ripping, rending, shattering all that attempted to arrest his course. Men have feared and shunned him since the beginning of time, and with good reason, for he has killed many of the human race. But although uncaught and untamed by them, our spark was not altogether unknown to the ancients. So far back as the year 600 before the Christian era, Thales, one of the Greek sages, discovered that he hid himself in amber, a substance which in Greek is named electron, hence his name electricity. But the ancients knew little about his character, though Thales found that he could draw him from his hiding place by rubbing him with silk and some other substances. When thus rubbed, he became attractive and drew light creatures towards him, not unlike human sparks. He also showed himself to be fickle, for after holding these light creatures tight for a brief space, he let them go and repelled them. It was not till the days of good Queen Bess, towards the end of the 16th century, that a Dr. Gilbert discovered that the wild fellow lay lurking in other substances besides amber, such as sulphur, wax, glass, etc. It is now known that electricity permeates all substances, more or less, and only waits to be roused in order to exhibit his amazing powers. He is fond of shocking people's feelings, and has surprised his pursuers rather frequently in that way. Some of them, indeed, he has actually shocked to death. It would take a huge volume to give a detailed account of all the qualities, powers, and peculiarities of this wild spark. We will just touch on a few facts which are necessary to the elucidation of our tale. A great event in the world's history happened in the year 1745. It was nothing less than the capture and imprisonment of wild, daring, dashing electricity. To the Dutch philosophers belongs the honor of catching him. They caught him, they even bottled him like ordinary spirits, and called his prison a Leyden jar. From that date, our spark became the useful and obedient slave of man. Yet is he ever ready, even when the smallest conceivable door, hole, or chink is left open, to dash out of the prison house man has made for him, and to escape into his native earth. He has no hope now, however, of escaping altogether, for he cannot resist the allurement of rubbing, by which, as well by chemical action and other means, we can summon him, like the genii of Aladdin's lamp, at any moment from the vastly deep, and compel him to do our work. And what sort of work, it may be asked, can this volatile fellow perform? We cannot tell all, the list is too long. Let us consider a few of them. If we fabricate teapots, sugar basins, spoons, or anything else of base metal, he can and will, at our bidding, cover the same with silver or yellow gold. If we grow dissatisfied with our candles and gas, he will, on being summoned and properly directed by the master minds to whom he owns allegiance, kindle our lamps and fill our streets and mansions with a blaze of noonday splendor. If we grow weary of steam and give him orders, he will drive our tramcars and locomotives with railway speed, minus railway smoke and fuss. He is a very giant in the chemist's laboratory, and above all a swift messenger to carry the world's news. Even when out and raging to and fro in a wild state, more than half disposed to rend our mansions and split our steeples and wreck our ships, we have only to provide him with a tiny metal staircase, down which he will instantly glide from the upper regions to the earth without noise or damage. Shakespeare never imagined, and Mercury never accomplished, the speeds at which he travels, and he will not only carry our news or express our sentiments and wishes far and wide over the land, but he will rush with them over rock, sand, mud, and ooze along the bottom of the deep, deep sea. And this brings us to a point. Some of the masterminds before mentioned, having conceived the idea that telegraphic communication might be carried on underwater, set about experimenting. Between the years 1839 and 1851, enterprising men in the Old World and the New suggested, pondered, planned, and placed wires underwater, along which our spark ran more or less successfully. One of the difficulties of these experiments consisted in this, that while the spark runs readily along one class of substances, he cannot or will not run along others. Substances of the first class, comprising the metals, are called conductors. Those of the second class, embracing among other things all resinous substances, are styled non-conductors. Now, water is a good conductor, so that although the spark will stick to wires when insulated on telegraph posts on land, he will bolt from them at once and take to flight the moment he gets under water. This difficulty was overcome by coating the wires with gutta percha, which, being a non-conductor, imprisoned the spark and kept him, as it were, on the line. A copper wire covered in this manner was not successfully laid between England and France in 1860. When tested, this cable did not work well. Minute imperfections in the form of air holes in the gutta percha afforded our spark an opportunity to bolt, and he did bolt as a matter of course, for electricity has no sense of honour and cannot be trusted near the smallest loophole. The imperfections were remedied. The door was effectually locked, after which the first submarine cable of importance was actually laid down and worked well. French and English believers turned up hands and eyes in delighted amazement as they held converse across the sea, while unbelievers were silenced and confounded. This happy state of things, however, lasted for only a few hours. Suddenly, the intercourse ceased. The telegraphists at both ends energized with their handles and needles, but without any result. The cable was dumb. Our spark had evidently escaped. There is no effect without a cause. The cause of that interruption was soon discovered. Early that morning, a French fisherman had sauntered down to the port of Boulogne and embarked on his boat. A British seaman, having nothing to do but smoke and meditate, was seated on a coil of rope at the time, enjoying himself and the smells with which that port is not unfamiliar. He chanced to be a friend of that French fisherman. "You're early afloat, monsieur," he said. "Oui, monsieur. Will you come? I go for fish." "Well, oui, I go for fun." They went accordingly, and bore away to the northwest along the coast before a light breeze, past the ruined towers which France has built to guard her port in days gone by, past the steep cliffs beyond Boulogne, past the lovely beach of Wimereux, with its cottages nestled among the sandhills, and its stilted-up harbour, whence Napoleon I had intended to issue forth and descend on perfidious Albion, but didn't, past cliffs and bays and villages further on, until they brought up off Cape Grisnez. Here the Frenchman let down his trawl, and fished up, among other curiosities of the deep, the submarine cable. "Behold, what is this?" he exclaimed, with glaring eyes, uplifted brows, shoulders shrugged, hands spread out, and fingers expanded. "The sea serpent growed thin," suggested the Englishman. "Non, c'est seaweed, weed the most extraordinaire in the world. Oui, donnez-moi the hatchet, the axe, mon ami." His friend handed him the axe, wherewith he cut off a small portion of the cable and let the end go. Little did that fisherman know that he had also let our spark go free, and cruelly dashed, for a time at least, the budding hopes of two nations. But so it was. He bore his prize in triumph to Boulogne, where he exhibited as a specimen of rare seaweed, with its centre filled with gold, while the telegraph clerks at both ends sat gazing in dismay at their useless instruments. Thus was the first submarine electric cable destroyed, and with the details of its destruction, little Robin was intimately acquainted, for cousin Sam had been a member of the staff that had worked the telegraph. At least he had been a boy in the office, and after years he so filled his cousin's mind with the importance of that cable and the grandeur and difficulty of the enterprise, that Robin became powerfully sympathetic, so much so that when Sam, in telling the story, came to the point where the Frenchman accomplished its destruction, Robin used to grieve over it as though he had lost a brother, or a kitten, or his latest toy. We need scarcely add that submarine cable telegraphy had not yet received its death blow on this occasion. Its possibility had been demonstrated. The very next year, 1851, Mr. T. R. Crampton, with Messrs. Wollaston, Cooper, and others, made and laid an improved cable between Dover and Calais, and ere long many other parts of the world were connected by means of snaky submarine electric cables. Chapter 3. Early Aspirations. One pleasant summer afternoon, Mr. Wright, coming in from the office, seated himself beside his composed little wife, who was patching a pair of miniature pantaloons. "Nan," said the husband, with a perplexed look, "what are we to do with our Robin when he grows up?" "George," answered the composed wife, "don't you think it is rather soon to trouble ourselves with that question? Robin is a mere child yet. We must first give him a good education." "Of course, I know that," returned the perplexed husband. "Still, I can't help thinking about what is to be done after he has had the good education. You know I have no relation in the world except Brother Richard, who is as poor as myself. We have no influential friends to help him into the army or the navy or the Indian civil service, and the church, you know, is not suitable for an imp. Just look at him now." Mrs. Wright looked through the window, over one of those sunny landscapes which are usually described as smiling, across a winding rivulet, and at last fixed her gorgeous eyes on a tall post, up which a small black object was seen to be struggling. "What can he be up to?" said the father. "He seems to be up the telegraph post," said the mother. "Investigating the wires, no doubt. I heard him talking about telegraphy to Madge this morning, retelling what Cousin Sam tries to teach him, and I shouldn't wonder if he were now endeavoring to make sure that what he told her was correct, for you know he is a thorough investigator." "Yes, I know it," murmured the father, with a grim pursing of his lips. "He investigated the inside of my watch last week, to find out, as he said, what made the noise in its stomach, and it has had intermittent fever ever since. 2 days ago he investigated my razor. It is now equal to a cross-cut saw, and as to my drawers and papers, excepting those which I lock up, there is but one word which fully describes the result of his investigations, and that is chaos." There was, in truth, some ground for that father's emotions, for Master Robin displayed investigative, not to say destructive, capacities, far in advance of his years. "Never mind, George," said Mrs. Wright soothingly. "We must put up with his little ways as best we may, consoling ourselves with the reflection that Robin has genius and perseverance, with which qualities he is sure to make his way in the world." "He has at all events made his way up the telegraph post," said Mr. Wright, his smile expanding and the grimness of it departing. "See, the rascal is actually stretching out his hand to grasp one of the wires. Hallo!" The composed wife became suddenly discomposed, and gave vent to a scream, for at that moment the small black object which they had been watching with so much interest was seen to fall backward, make a wild grasp at nothing with both hands, and fall promptly to the ground. His father threw up the window, leaped out, dashed across the 4 feet wide lawn, cleared the winding rivulet, and cut, like a hunted hare, over the smiling landscape towards the telegraph post, at the foot of which he picked up his unconscious, though not much injured, son. "What made you climb the post, Robin?" asked his cousin Madge that evening, as she nursed the adventurous boy on her knee, and Madge was a very motherly nurse, although a full year younger than Robin. "I kimmed it to see if I could hear the tricity," replied the injured one. "The 'lectricity," said Madge, correcting. "You must learn to pronounce your words properly, dear. You'll never be a great man if you are so careless." "I don't want to be a great man," retorted Robin. "I only want to understand things what puzzles them." "Well, does the telegraph puzzle you?" "Oh, most awfully," returned Robin, with a solemn gaze of his earnest eyes, one of which was rendered fantastic by a yellow-green ring round it and a swelling underneath. "I's quite sure I stood for hours beside dat post listening to it hummin' and bummin' like an Now, Robin, do be careful. You know Mama calls it an Olean harp." "Yes, well, like our Olean harp, only a great deal louder and far nicer. And I's often said to myself, is that the tricity? Lek, Robin, lek. Well, yes, lectricity. So I thought I'd come up and see, for, Papa says the tricity, runs along the wires." "But Papa also says," interrupted Madge, "that the sounds you want to know about are made by the Brayton," suggested the invalid. "Yes, vibraton of the wires." "I wonder what vibraton means," murmured Robin, turning his lustrous though damaged eyes meditatively on the landscape. "Don't know for sure," says Madge, "but I think it means tremblin'." It will be seen from the above conversation that Robert Wright and his precocious cousin Marjorie were of a decidedly philosophical turn of mind. Chapter 4. Extraordinary Result of an Attempt at Amateur Cable Laying. Time continued to roll additional years off his reel, and rolled out Robin and Madge in length and breadth, though we cannot say much for thickness. Time also developed their minds, and Robin gradually began to understand a little more of the nature of that subtle fluid, if we may so venture to call it, under the influence of what he had been born. "Come, Madge," he said one day, throwing on his cap, "let us go and play at cables." Madge, ever ready to play at anything, put on her sunbonnet and followed her ambitious leader. "Is it to be land telegraphs today, or submarine cables?" inquired Madge, with as much gravity and earnestness as if the world's welfare depended on the decision. "Cables, of course," answered Robin. "Why, Madge, I have done with land telegraphs now. There's nothing more to learn about them. Cousin Sam has put me up to everything, you know. Besides, there's no mystery about landlines. Why, you've only got to stick up a whole lot of posts with insulators screwed to 'em, fix wires to the insulators, clap on an electric battery and telegraph instrument, and fire away." "Robin, what are insulators?" asked Madge, with a puzzled look. "Madge," replied Robin, with a self-satisfied expression on his pert face, "this is the 300,000th time I have explained that to you." "Explain it the 300,001st time then, dear Robin, and perhaps I'll take it in." "Well," began Robin, with a hypocritical sigh of despair, "you must know that everything in nature is more or less a conductor of electricity, but some things conduct it so well, such as copper and iron, that they are called conductors, and some things, such as glass and earthenware, conduct it so very badly that they scarcely conduct it at all, and are known as non-conductors. D'ye see?" "Oh, yes, I see, Robin. So does a bat, but he doesn't see well. However, go on." "Well, if I were to run my wire through the posts that support it, my electricity would escape down these posts into the earth, especially if the posts were wet with rain, for water is a good conductor, and Mr. Electricity has an irresistible desire to bolt into the earth like a mole." "Naughty fellow," murmured Madge. "But," continued Robin impressively, "if I fix little lumps of glass with a hole in them to the posts, and fix my wires to these, electricity cannot bolt, because the glass lumps are non-conductors, and won't let him pass." "How good of them," says Madge. "Yes, isn't it? So you see," continued Robin, "the glass lumps are insulators, for they cut the electricity off from the earth as an island is, or, at all events, appears to be, cut off from it by water, and Mr. Electricity must go along the wires, and do what I tell him. Of course, I must make my electricity first in a battery, which, as I have often and often told you, is a trough containing a mixture of acid and water, with plates or slices of zinc and copper in it, placed one after the other, but not touching each other. How, if I fix a piece of wire to my first copper slice or plate, and the other end of it to my last zinc slice or plate, immediately electricity will begin to be made, and will fly from the copper to the zinc, and so round and round until the plates are worn out or the wire broken. Do you see?" No, Robin, I don't see. I'm blinder than the blindest mole. Oh, Madge, what a wonderful mind you must have, said Robin, laughing. It is so simple. Of course, said Madge. I understand what you mean by troughs and plates and all that, but what I want to know is why that arrangement is necessary. Why would it not do just as well to tempt electricity out of its hiding hole with plates or slices of cheese and bread, placed one after the other in a trough filled with a mixture of glue and melted butter? What stuff you do talk, Madge. As well might you ask why it would not do to make a plum pudding out of nutmegs and coal tar. There are some things that no fellow can understand, and of course I don't know everything. The astounding modesty of this latter remark seemed to have furnished Madge with food for reflection, for she did not reply to it. After a few minutes' walk, the amateur electricians reached the scene of their intended game, a sequestered dell in a plantation, through which brawled a rather turbulent stream. At one part, where a willow overhung the water, there was a deep, broad pool. The stream entered the pool with a headlong plunge, and issued from it with a riotous upheaval of wavelets and foam along jagged rocks, as if rejoicing in, and rather boastful about, the previous leap. The game was extremely simple. The pool was to be the German Ocean, and a piece of stout cord was to serve as a submarine cable. The boy and girl were well-matched playmates, for Madge was ignorant and receptive, in reference to science, Robin learned and communicative, while both were intensely earnest. Now, this is the battery, said Robin, when he had cut a deep hole close to the pool with a spade brought for the purpose. Yes, and the muddy water in it will do for the mixture of acid and water, said Madge. As she spoke, Robin's toe caught on a root, and he went headlong into the battery, out of which he emerged scarcely recognizable. It was a severe, though not an electric, shock, and at first Robin seemed inclined to whimper, but his manhood triumphed, and he burst into a compound laugh and yell, to the intense relief of Madge, who thought at first that he had been seriously injured. Never mind, Madge, said Robin, as he cleaned his muddy head. Cousin Sam has often told that nothing great was ever done except in the face of difficulties and dangers. I wonder whether this should be counted as a difficulty or a danger. At first I thought it was a danger, said Madge with a laugh, but the trouble you now have with the mud in your hair looks like a difficulty, doesn't it? Why then, it's both, cried Robin. Come, that's a good beginning. Now, Madge, you get away round to the opposite side of the pool, and mind you don't slip in. It's rather steep here. This is England, cried Robin, preparing to throw the line over to his assistant, who stood eager to aid on the other side. And you are standing on... what's on the other side of the German Ocean? I'm not sure, Robin. Holland, I think, or Denmark. Well, we'll say Denmark. Look out now and be ready to catch. I'm going to connect England and Denmark with a submarine cable. Stay, cried Madge. Is that the way submarine cables are laid, by throwing them over the sea? No, not exactly. They had a steamboat, to carry over the telegraph from England to France, but we haven't got a steamer, not even a plank to make believe one. Cousin Sam says that a good workman can do his work with almost any tools that come to hand. As we have no tools at all, we will improve on that and go to work without them. Now catch. Robin made a splendid heave, so splendid indeed that it caused him to stagger backward, and again he stumbled into his own battery. This time, however, only one leg was immersed. Another danger, shouted Madge in great glee, but I've caught the cable. All right, now make fast the shore end to a bush, and we'll commence telegraphing. The first must be a message from the Queen to the King of Denmark, or is it the President? King, I think, Robin, but I'm not sure. Well, it won't matter, but I say, what's wrong now? Why, the cable won't sink. It's floating about on the top of the pool, and it can't be a submarine cable, unless it sinks. Another difficulty, Robin. We will face and overcome it, Madge. Cast off the shore end, and I'll soon settle that. Having fastened a number of small stones to the cable, this persevering electrician would certainly have overcome the difficulty if the line had not, when thrown, unfortunately caught on the branch of the willow, where it hung suspended just out of Madge's reach. How provoking, she said, stretching out a hand to the utmost. Take care, you'll... Ha! The warning came too late. The edge of the bank gave way, and Madge went headlong into the pool with a wild shriek and a fearful plunge. Robin stood rooted to the spot, heart, breath, blood, brain paralyzed for the moment, gazing at the spot where his playmate had disappeared. Another moment, and her head and hands appeared. She struggled bravely for life, while the circling current carried her quickly towards the lower end of the pool. Robin's energies returned, as he afterwards said, like an electric shock, but accompanied with a terrible sinking of the heart, for he knew that he could not swim. His education in this important particular had been neglected. He sprang round to the lower end of the pool just in time to hold out his hand to the drowning girl. He almost touched her outstretched hand as she swept towards the turbulent waters below, but failed to grasp it. For the first time in his life, our little hero was called on to face death voluntarily. Another moment, and Madge would have been caught in the boiling stream that rushed towards the fall below. He was equal to the occasion. He sprang right upon Madge and caught her in his arms. There was no need to hold on to her. In the agony of fear, the poor child clasped the boy in deadly embrace. They were whirled violently round and hurled against a rock. Robin caught it with one hand, but was instantly torn from his grasp. The waters overwhelmed them, and again sent them violently towards the bank. This time, Robin caught a rock with both hands and held on. Slowly, whilst almost choked with the water that splashed up into his face, he worked his right knee into a crevice, then made a wild grasp with his left hand at a higher projection of the rock. At the same moment, his left foot struck the bottom. Another effort, and he was out of danger, but it was several minutes ere he succeeded in dragging Madge from the hissing water of the shallows to the green sward above, and after this was accomplished, he found it almost impossible to tear himself from the grasp of the now unconscious girl. At first, poor Robin thought that his companion was dead, but by degrees consciousness returned, and at last she was able to rise and walk. Drenched, dishevelled, and depressed, these unfortunate electricians returned home. Of course, they were received with mingled joy and reproof. Of course, also, they were forbidden to go near the pool again, though this prohibition was afterwards removed, and our hero ultimately became a first-rate swimmer and diver. Thus was frustrated the laying of the first submarine cable between England and Denmark. Chapter 5. Prospects of Real Cable Laying. Robin meets with his first electrical acquaintances. Circumstances require that we should shift the scene and date pretty frequently in this tale. We solicit the reader's attendance at an office in London. The office is dingy. Many offices are so. 2 clerks are sitting in it, making faces at each other across the desk. They are not lunatics. They are not imbeciles or idlers. On the contrary, they have frequent spells of work that might throw the toils of an Arab ass into the shade. They are fine, strapping young fellows, with pent-up energies equal to anything, but afflicted with occasional periods of having nothing particular to do. These 2 have been sitting all morning in busy idleness. Their muscular and nervous systems rebelling have induced much fidgeting and many wry faces. Being original, they have turned their sorrows into a game, and their little game at present is to see which can make a face so hideous that the other will be compelled to laugh. We have deep sympathy with clerks. We have been a clerk. We know what it is to have the fires of Vesuvius raging within, while the necessity of exhibiting the cool aspect of Spitzbergen without. But these clerks were not entirely miserable. On the contrary, they were, to use one of their own familiar phrases, rather jolly than otherwise. Evening was before them in far-off but attainable perspective. Home, lawn tennis, in connection with bright eyes and pretty faces, would compensate for the labours of the day and let off steam. They were deep in their game when a rap at the door brought their faces suddenly to a state of nature. "Come in," said the first clerk. "And wipe your feet," murmured the second in a low tone. A gentleman with an earnest countenance entered. "Is Mr. Lowestoft in his office?" "He is, sir," said the first clerk, descending from his perch with an air of goodwill, and requesting the visitor's name and business. The visitor handed his card, on which the name Cyrus Field was written, and the clerk, observing it, admitted the owner at once to the inner sanctum, where Mr. Lowestoft transacted business. "There's something up," murmured the clerk, with a mysterious look at his comrade on resuming his perch. "Time's up, or nearly so," replied the comrade, with an anxious look at the clock. "The witching hour which sets us free to saunter home and have our tea approaches." "Do you know what that is, Cyrus Field?" said the first clerk. "And who is Cyrus Field?" demanded the second clerk. "Oh, ignoramus, thy name is Bob, and thou art not worth a bob, miserable snob. Don't you know that Cyrus Field is the man who brought about the laying of the great Atlantic cable in 1858? "No, most learned Fred, I did not know that, but I am very glad to know it now. Moreover, I know nothing whatever about cables, Atlantic or otherwise. I am as blind as a bat, as ignorant as a bigot, as empty as a soap bubble, and as wise as Solomon, because I'm willing to be taught." "What a delicious subject to work upon," said Fred. "Well then, work away," returned Bob. "Suppose you give me a discourse on cables, but I say, be merciful. Don't overdo it, Frederick. Remember that my capacity is feeble." "I'll be careful, Bob. Well then, you must know that from the year 1840 submarine cables had been tried and laid, and worked with more or less success in various parts of the world. Sir W. O'Shaughnessy, I believe, began it. Irishmen are frequently at the root of mischief. Anyhow, he, being superintendent of electric telegraphs in India in 1839, hauled an insulated wire across the Hooghly at Calcutta, and produced what they called an electrical phenomena at the other side of the river. In 1840, Mr. Wheatstone brought before the House of Commons the project of a cable from Dover to Calais. In 1842, Professor Morse of America laid a cable in New York Harbor, and another across the canal at Washington. He also suggested the possibility of laying a cable across the Atlantic Ocean. In 1846, Colonel Colt, of revolver notoriety, and Mr. Robinson laid a wire from New York to Brooklyn, and from Long Island to Corry Island. In 1849, "I say, Bob," interrupted Bob, with an anxious look, "you are a walking dictionary of dates. Hayden was nothing to you, but couldn't you give it to me without dates? I've got no head for dates, never could stomach them, except when fresh off the palm tree. Don't you think that a lecture without dates would be pleasantly original as well as instructive?" "No, Bob, I don't, and I won't be guilty of any such gross innovation on time-honored custom. You must swallow my dates whether you like them or not. In 1849, I say, a Mr. Walker, any relation to Hookey? No, son, none whatsoever. He laid a wire from Folkestone to a steamer 2 miles off the shore, and sent messages to it. At last, in 1851, Mr. Brett laid down and successfully wrought the cable between Dover and Calais, which had been suggested by Wheatstone 11 years before. It is true it did not work long, but this may be said to have been the beginning of submarine telegraphy, which, as you see, like your own education, Bob, has been a thing of slow growth. "Have you done with dates now, my learned friend?" asked Bob, attempting to balance a ruler on the point of his nose. "Not quite, my ignorant chum, but nearly. That same year, 1851, remember, a Mr. Frederick N. Gisborne, an English electrician, made the first attempt to connect Newfoundland with the American continent by cable. He also started a company to facilitate intercourse between America and Ireland by means of steamers and telegraph cables. Gisborne was very energetic and successful, but got into pecuniary difficulties and went to New York to raise the wind. There he met with Cyrus Field, who took the matter up with tremendous enthusiasm. He expanded Gisborne's idea and resolved to get up a company to connect Newfoundland with Ireland by electric cable. Field was rich and influential, and ultimately successful. "Ah, would that you and I were rich, Fred," interrupted Bob, as he let fall the ruler with a crash on the red ink bottle and overturned it. "But go on, Fred, I'm getting interested. Pardon the interruption, and never mind the ink, I'll swab it up. He was successful, wasn't he?" "Yes, he was, eminently so. He first of all roused his friends in the States, and got up, in 1856, the New York, Newfoundland, and London Telegraph Company, which carried a line of telegraph through the British provinces, and across the Gulf of St. Lawrence to St. John's, Newfoundland, more than 1,000 miles at the cost of about £500,000. Then he came over to England and roused the British Lion, with whose aid he started the Atlantic Telegraph Company, and fairly began the work, backed by such men as Brett, Biddon, Stevenson, Brunei, Glass, Elliot, Morse, Bright, Whitehouse, and a host of others. But all this was not done in a day. Cyrus Field laboured for years among preliminaries, and it was not until 1857 that a regular attempt was made to lay an Atlantic cable. It failed because the cable broke and was lost. A second attempt was made in 1858, and it was successful. In that year, my boy, Ireland and Newfoundland were married, and on the 5th of August, the first electrical message passed between the Old World and the New, through a small wire over a distance of above 2,000 miles. But the triumph of Field and his friends was short-lived, for soon after something went wrong with the cable, and on the 6th of September it ceased to work. "What a pity," exclaimed Bob. "So it all went off in smoke." "Not quite that, Bob. Before the cable struck work, about 400 messages had been sent, which proved its value in a financial point of view, and one of these messages, sent from London in the morning and reaching Halifax the same day, directed that the 62nd Regiment was not to return to England, and it is said that this timely warning saved the country an expenditure of £50,000. But the failure, instead of damping, has evidently stimulated the energies of Mr. Field, who has been going between America and England ever since, stirring people up far and near to raise the funds necessary for another attempt. He gives himself no rest, has embarked his own fortune in the affair, and now, at this moment, in the year of grace 1865, is doing his best, I have no doubt, to induce our governor, Mr. Lowestoft, to embark in that same boat with himself." It would seem as if Fred had been suddenly endowed with the gift of second sight, for at that moment the door of his employer's room opened, and Mr. Lowestoft came out, saying to his visitor in the most friendly tones that he had the deepest sympathy with his self-sacrificing efforts, and with the noble work to which he devoted himself. Bob, in a sudden enthusiasm, leaped off his stool, opened the office door, and muttered something as the distinguished visitor passed him. "I beg pardon," said Mr. Field, checking himself. "What did you say?" I wish you good luck, sir, with the new cable," stammered the clerk, blushing deeply. "Thank you, lad, thank you," said Mr. Field, with a pleasant smile and nod as he went away. "Mr. Syme," said Mr. Lowestoft to Bob, turning at the door of his room, "send young Wright to me." "Yes, sir," replied the obedient Bob, going to a corner of the room and applying his lips to a speaking tube. Now young Wright was none other than our hero Robin, grown up to the mature age of 15. He was perched on the top of a three-legged stool, and from the slow and intensely earnest manner in which his head turned from side to side as he wrote, it was quite evident that he dotted all his I's and stroked all his T's with conscientious care. As he sat there, a sturdy little broad-shouldered fellow, so deeply engrossed with his work that he was oblivious to all around, he seemed the very beau ideal of painstaking, hard-working clerk. So deeply was he engrossed in his subject, the copying of an invoice, that he failed to hear the voice of his fellow clerk, although the end of the speaking tube was not far from where he sat. After listening a few seconds at the other end of the tube, Bob Syme repeated the summons with such vigour that Robin leaped from his stool, as though he had received one of his favourite electric shocks. A minute later, he stood in the presence of the head of the house. "Robert Wright," said the head, pushing his spectacles up on his brow, "I shall be sorry to lose your services, but—" He paused and turned over the papers before him, as if searching for something, and Robert's heart sank. Was he going to be dismissed? Had he done anything wrong, or had he unwittingly neglected some duty? "Ah, there it is," resumed Mr. Lowestoft. "A letter from a friend who has come by with a slight injury to his right hand, and wants a smart amanuensis and general assistant. Now I think of sending you to him, if you have no objection." As the head again paused while glancing over the letter, Robin ventured timidly to state that he had very strong objections, that he was very much satisfied with his situation and work, and had no desire to change. Mr. Lowestoft did not appear to listen to his remarks, but said suddenly, "You've studied the science of electricity, I believe." "Yes, sir, to some extent," answered the lad with a look of surprise. "I know you have. Your father has told me about your tastes and studies. You have heard of Mr. Cyrus Field, I presume." "Indeed I have," said Robin, brightening up. "It was through his efforts that the Atlantic cable was laid in 1858, which unfortunately went wrong." Well, my boy, it is through his efforts that another cable is about to be laid this year, 1865, which we all hope sincerely won't go wrong, and my friend, who wants an assistant, is one of the electricians connected with the new expedition. Would you like to go?" Robin's eyes blazed, and he could scarcely find breath or words to express his willingness, if his father did not object. "Go home at once, then, and ask leave, for the Great Eastern is almost ready for sea, and you will have to hasten your preparations." Robin stroked no more T's and dotted no more I's that day. We fear, indeed, that he even left the invoice on his desk unfinished, with the last I imperfect. Bursting into his father's house, he found Madge, now became a pretty little slip of feminine thread paper, seated at the piano agonizing over a chord which her hand was too small to compass. "Madge, Madge, cousin Madge," he shouted, seizing both the extended little hands and kissing the musical wrinkles from her brow. "Why am I like a magnet? You'll never guess." "Because you attract everybody to you," said Madge promptly. "Pooh, not at all. A magnet doesn't attract everybody. It has 2 poles, don't you know, and repels some bodies. No, Madge, it's because I have been electrified." "Indeed? And what has electrified you, Robin?" "The Atlantic cable, Madge." "Well, that ought to be able to do it powerfully," returned Madge with a laugh. "But tell me all about it, and don't make more bad conundrums. I'm sure something has happened. What is it?" Mrs. Wright, entering at the moment, her son calmed himself as well as he could, and sat down to tell his tale and talk the matter over. "Now, what think you, mother? Will father consent?" "I think he will, Robin, but before going into the matter further, I will lay it before our Father in heaven. He must show us the way, if we are to go right." According to invariable custom, Robin's mother retired to her own room to consider the proposal. Thereafter she had a long talk with her husband, and the result was that on the following day our hero found himself in a train, with a small new portmanteau by his side, a new billycock hat on his head, a very small new purse in his pocket, with a remarkably small sum of money therein, and a light yet full heart in his breast. He was on his way to the Nore, where the Great Eastern lay, like an antediluvian macaroni-eater, gorging itself with innumerable miles of Atlantic cable. To say truth, Robin's breast, capacious though it was for his size, could hardly contain his heart that day. The dream of his childhood was about to be realized. He had thirsted for knowledge. He had acquired all that was possible in his father's limited circumstances. He had, moreover, with the valuable assistance of Sam Shipton, become deeply learned in electrical science. He had longed with all his heart to become an electrician, quite ready, if need were, to commence as sweeper of a telegraph office, but he had come to regard his desires as too ambitious, and, accepting his lot in life with the quiet contentment taught by his mother, had entered on a clerkship in a mercantile house, and had perched himself, with a little sigh, no doubt, yet cheerfully, on the top of a 3-legged stool. To this stool he had been so long attached, physically, that he had begun to regard it as almost part and parcel of himself, and had made up his mind that he would have to stick it through life. He even sometimes took a quaint view of the matter, and tried to imagine that through long habit it would stick to him at last, and oblige him to carry it about sticking straight behind him, perhaps even require him to take it to bed with him, in which case he sometimes tried to imagine that would be the precise effect on the bedclothes if he were turned from one side to the other. Thus had his life been projected, in grey perspective, to his mental eye. But now he actually was an electrician-elect, on his way to join the biggest ship in the world, to aid in laying the greatest telegraph cable in the world, in company with some of the greatest men in the universe. It was almost too much for him. He thirsted for sympathy. He wanted to let off his feelings in a cheer, but life in a lunatic asylum presented itself, and he refrained. There was a rough-looking sailor lad, about his own age, but much bigger, on the seat opposite. It was a 3rd class. He thought of pouring out his feelings on him, but prudence prevented. There is no saying what might have been the result, figuratively speaking, to his boiler, if the sailor lad had not of his own accord opened a safety valve. "You seems pretty bobbish this morning, young fella," he said, after contemplating his vis-a-vis for a long time in critical silence. "Been and took too much, eh?" "I beg your pardon?" said Robin, somewhat puzzled. "You're a pretty considerate jolly, I say." returned the lad, who had an honest, ugly face, and was somewhat blunt and gruff in manner. "I am indeed very jolly," said Robin, with a bland smile, "for I'm going to help lay the Great Atlantic Cable." "What's that you say?" demanded the lad, with sudden animation. Robin repeated his remark. "Well, now that is a go. Why, I'm going to help the Great Atlantic Cable too. I'm one of the steward's boys. What may you be, young fella?" "Me? Oh, I'm on the electrical staff. He thought of the word secretary, but a feeling of modesty induced him to say, assistant to one of the electricians." "Which on?" demanded the lad curtly. "Mr. Smith." "Mr. Smith, eh? Well, it ain't such an unusual name. Smith ain't. Perhaps you'll condescend on his first name, for there's no less than 3 Smiths among the electricians." "Ebenezer Smith, I believe," said Robin. "Ebby Sneezer Smith, eh? Well, upon my word, that's a Smith mixture that I never heard on before. I don't know him, but he's all right, I dare say. There's a rum lot together." Whether this compliment was meant for the great Smith family in general, or the electrical branch in particular, Robin could not guess, and did not like to ask. Having thus far opened his heart, however, he began to pour out its contents, and found that the ugly sailor lad was a much more sympathetic soul than he had been led to expect from his looks. Having told his own name, he asked that of his companion in return. "My name? It's Slag. Jim Slag. James, when you wants to be respectful. Slag, when familiar. I'm the son of Jim Slag, Senior. Who he was the son of is best known to them as understands the science of Jimmylology. But it don't much matter, for we all runs back to Adam and Eve somehow. They called me after father, of course, but to make a distinction, they calls him Jimmy, being more respectful like, and me Jim. It ain't a name much to boast of, but I wouldn't change it with you, young fella, though Robert ain't a bad name neither. It's pretty well known, you see, and that's something then that's been bore by great men. Let me think. Wasn't there a Robert the Great once?" "I fear not," said Robert. "He is yet in the womb of time." "Ah, well, no matter, but there should have been a Robert the Great before now. Anyhow, there was Robert the Bruce. He was a king, weren't he? And the skull cracker. Then there was Robert Stevenson, the great engineer. He's living yet. And there was a Robert the Devil, but I'd rather fear he'd have been a bad one. He must, so we won't count him. Of course, they gave you another name for short. Robin. I thought so. Well, that ain't a bad name neither. There was a Robin Hood, you know, what drawed the longbow a deal better than the worst penny-a-liner as ever mended a quill. And there was Robin Goodfellow, though I don't rightly remember who he was exactly." "One of Shakespeare's characters," interposed Robin. "Just so. Well, he couldn't have been a bad fellow, you know. Then, as to your other name, Wright, that's all right, you know. It might have been a bad writer if you'd taken to the quill or the law. Anyhow, as long as you're right, of course you can't be wrong. Young fella?" Jim Slag was so tickled with this sudden sally that he laughed, and in doing so shut his little eyes and opened an enormous mouth, fully furnished with an unbroken set of splendid teeth. Thus pleasantly did Robin while away the time with his future shipmate, until he arrived at the end of his journey, when he parted from Jim Slag and was met by Ebenezer Smith. That energetic electrician, instead of at once taking him on board the Great Eastern, took him to a small inn, where he gave him his tea and put him through a rather severe electrical examination, out of which our hero emerged with credit. "You'll do, Robin," said his examiner, who was a free and easy yet kindly electrician, "but you do want instruction in many things." "Indeed I do, sir," said Robin, "for I have had no regular education in science, but I hope, if you direct me what to study, that I shall improve." "No doubt you will, my boy. Meanwhile, as the big ship won't be ready to start for some time, I want you to go to the works of the Telegraph Construction and Maintenance Company, see the making of cable, learn all you can, and write me a careful account of all that you see and all that you think about it." Robin could not repress a smile. "Why, boy, what are you laughing at?" demanded Mr. Smith, somewhat sternly. Robin blushed deep scarlet as he replied, "Pardon me, sir, but you said I am to write down all that I think about it." "Well, what then?" "I'm afraid, sir," stammered Robin, that if I write down all I think about the Atlantic cable, as well as all that I see, I shall require a very long time indeed, with a pretty large volume." Mr. Smith gazed at our hero for some time with uplifted brows. Then he shook his head slowly and frowned. Then he nodded it slightly and smiled. After that he laughed, or rather chuckled, and said, "Well, you may go now, and do what I have told you, only omitting most of what you think. A small portion of that will suffice. Don't hurry back. Go home and make a fair copy of your observations and thoughts. I'll write what I require you. Stay, your address? I have it in my notebook. What's your first name, Mr. Wright?" Robin grew 2 inches taller or more on the spot. He had never been called Mr. before, except in jest. "Robert, sir," he replied. "Robert, I'll call you Bob. I never could stand ceremony, so you'll accustom yourself to the new name as quickly as you can, but perhaps it's not new to you." "Please, sir, I've been used to Robin. If you have no objection, I should—" "No objection, of course not," interrupted Mr. Smith. "Robin will do quite as well, though a little longer, but that's no matter. Goodbye, Robin, and don't think too hard. It sometimes hurts digestion. Goodbye." "Well, what do you think of Ebenezer Smith, my electrical tulip?" asked Jim Slag, whom Robin encountered again at the station. "He's a wiry subject, I suppose, like the rest of them." "He's a very pleasant gentleman," answered Robin warmly. "Oh, of course he is. All the Smiths are so, more or less. They're a glorious family. I knows at least half a dozen of 'em in what superfine people call the slums of London." And I know more than half a dozen of 'em," retorted Robin, somewhat sharply, "in what unrefined people call the aristocracy of London." "Phew," whistled Mr. Slag, gazing at Robin in silent surprise. What the whistle implied was not explained at that time, because the locomotive whistle took up the tune with intense violence, causing a rush to the train, in which the two lads, like many other friends, were abruptly parted for a season.